The first thing my father did after my grandfather died was ask the funeral director how quickly the death certificate would be ready. Not whether Grandpa had suffered. Not whether I was okay. Not even whether anyone had called the rest of the family. Just one cold question. How soon can we get the paperwork? I stood 3 feet away, staring at him, wondering if grief had frozen my hearing. The funeral director blinked in surprise before quietly answering, usually within a few days. Dad simply nodded as if someone had confirmed a delivery date. That's when I realized something terrible. He wasn't mourning. He was waiting. Waiting for the inheritance. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until that week, I believed every family eventually found its way back to each other. I was wrong. Some families don't fall apart overnight. They rot from the inside for years, until one death exposes everything. For mine, that death was my grandfather, William Carter. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was the only person in the family who ever made me feel like I belonged. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. Dad owned a construction company. My younger brother, Ryan, had always been the favorite. He crashed 2 trucks before turning 25. Dad bought him a third. He dropped out of college. Dad called him a free spirit. He lost nearly $200,000 on a failed business. Dad blamed the economy. When I earned a scholarship to the University of Kentucky, nobody came to celebrate. Dad looked at my acceptance letter for less than 5 seconds before saying, "Good, at least you won't cost me tuition." That was his version of congratulations. Grandpa was different. Every Saturday morning, he'd pick me up in his old red pickup truck. We'd drive out to his ranch outside town. While everyone else talked about money, he taught me how to repair fences, care for horses, and fix broken engines. He always said, "Emma, people show their true character when they think nobody's watching." At 12 years old, I thought he was talking about strangers. Years later, I realized he'd been talking about our family. Grandpa never cared about expensive things. His boots were older than I was. His pickup had over 300,000 miles on it. But every promise he made, he kept. When I graduated from college, he drove 6 hours just to watch me walk across the stage. Dad texted me. Grandpa showed up. That difference explained our entire relationship. 3 weeks before he died, Grandpa called me. His voice sounded weaker than I'd ever heard. "Emma, can you come by tomorrow?" I canceled work immediately. When I arrived, he was sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee waiting. The autumn wind carried dry leaves across the yard. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled. "You've always known how to enjoy silence." I laughed. "You taught me." He looked toward the fields. "I won't be around much longer." "Don't say that." "It's true." He wasn't afraid. He was simply stating a fact. Then his expression became serious. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. When the time comes, don't fight for what's mine." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "No matter what happens. No matter what anyone says. No matter what you think you've lost. Promise me." I didn't understand. But I trusted him. "I promise." He squeezed my hand. Then he smiled again. "Good." Looking back, that promise changed my life. Grandpa passed away 18 days later in his sleep. Peacefully. Exactly the way he'd always hoped. The funeral filled the small country church. Neighbors came. Old ranch workers came. Veterans he had quietly helped over the years came. People I'd never met stood in line just to say one thing. He was the best man I ever knew. Meanwhile, inside our family row, nobody talked about Grandpa. Dad whispered to Ryan about lawyers. My stepmother, Karen, kept checking real estate listings on her phone. Ryan joked about turning the ranch into a luxury wedding venue. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stayed silent. Because Grandpa had taught me something else. Never interrupt people while they're revealing who they really are. After the service, everyone drove to the attorney's office. The atmosphere felt strangely cheerful. Ryan actually stopped for expensive coffee on the way. Karen talked about remodeling the ranch house before anyone had inherited it. Dad kept repeating. Dad always knew what was best. I noticed something. Not one of them said they missed him. Not once. The attorney, Mr. Benjamin Hayes, greeted us with tired eyes. He had been Grandpa's lawyer for over 25 years. He waited until everyone sat down. Then he unfolded a thick folder. This is the last will and testament of William Carter. The room became perfectly still. Ryan leaned forward. Karen smiled. Dad folded his hands confidently. I felt sick. Not because I cared about the money. Because hearing someone's life reduced to paperwork felt unbearably sad. Mr. Hayes began reading. Grandpa left donations to the local animal shelter. Money for a veterans foundation. Scholarships for 2 trade schools. Several longtime employees received generous gifts. I smiled. That sounded exactly like him. Then came the family section. Ryan inherited Grandpa's antique rifle collection. Karen received a small piece of jewelry Grandpa had promised years ago. Dad inherited several investment accounts. Then, Mr. Hayes paused. He looked directly at me. I held my breath. To my granddaughter, Emma Carter. My heart pounded. I leave. He stopped reading. His face changed. He blinked once. Then looked back down at the page. Nothing. The room fell silent. For exactly 1 second. Then Ryan laughed. Karen covered her smile with one hand. Dad slowly leaned back in his chair. I guess Dad finally saw things clearly. Every eye turned toward me. I didn't say a word. Because I remembered my promise. Don't fight for what's mine. I stood up quietly. Picked up my purse. And walked toward the door. Behind me, I could still hear Ryan laughing. I had no idea. Someone was already running after me with something Grandpa had planned long before any of us entered that room. The courthouse parking lot was almost empty. Gray clouds hung low over the city, and a cold wind swept fallen leaves across the pavement. I unlocked my car, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not because I'd lost an inheritance. Because, for one painful moment, I believed my grandfather had chosen everyone else over me. I kept hearing Mr. Hayes's voice. To my granddaughter, Emma Carter, I leave. Nothing. Nothing. One word. 31 years of memories crushed into a single sentence. I climbed into my car and closed the door. The silence was unbearable. Then someone knocked on my window. I looked up. Mr. Benjamin Hayes stood outside, slightly out of breath. He almost never hurried. Seeing him like that made my stomach tighten. I rolled the window down. Emma. His voice was quieter now. I need you to come back inside. I shook my head. I think I've heard enough. No. He glanced toward the attorney's office. They cannot hear this. My heartbeat quickened. What do you mean? Instead of answering, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. Across the front, in neat handwriting I recognized instantly, were 6 words. For Emma, after everyone leaves. My throat closed. That was Grandpa's handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere. Mr. Hayes held the envelope with both hands. He made me promise, he said softly. He told me that no matter what happened inside that room, I was not to give this to you until every member of your family had left. I stared at the envelope. So, he planned this? Mr. Hayes nodded. Over 2 years ago. I looked back toward the building. Through the front window, I could see my father smiling. Ryan was already pointing at something on a document. Karen looked happier than she had at the funeral. They thought they had won. Mr. Hayes looked at me carefully. Emma, your grandfather trusted you more than anyone I've ever represented. I suggest you read this somewhere private. I swallowed hard. Is this another will? I can't answer that. Why not? Because I gave William Carter my word. He placed the envelope in my hands. It felt heavier than paper should. almost as if it carried the weight of everything Grandpa had never said. Before leaving, Mr. Hayes stopped beside my car. "One more thing." I looked up. "Whatever you decide after reading it, don't rush." Then he walked away. I didn't drive home. Instead, I drove to Grandpa's ranch. Or what I thought was no longer Grandpa's ranch. The front gate creaked exactly the way it always had. The porch swing moved gently in the wind. Everything looked the same. Except, it felt empty. I sat on the porch steps where Grandpa and I had shared hundreds of conversations. The envelope rested in my lap. For nearly 10 minutes. I couldn't open it. Because as long as it stayed sealed, there was still hope. Hope that Grandpa hadn't forgotten me. Finally, I broke the wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. More than 10 pages. The first line blurred instantly as tears filled my eyes. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then everything happened exactly as I expected." I stopped breathing. "Expected?" I continued. "Right now your father believes he has won. Ryan is probably smiling. Karen is pretending to be surprised while secretly celebrating." I looked toward the ranch house. How had Grandpa known? Every word was true. I kept reading. "Don't be angry with them. Greed has a way of making people reveal themselves without any help." My hands trembled. Grandpa had written this before he died. Long before. He had known exactly how everyone would react. The next page explained everything. 3 years earlier, Grandpa had invited every family member to the ranch. One at a time. Not for dinner. For a conversation. He asked each of them the same simple question. "If something happened to me tomorrow, what would you miss the most?" Ryan answered first. "Probably the ranch." Karen said. "This land is worth a fortune now." My father replied. "Keeping everything in the family is what matters." Grandpa later discovered. Dad had already contacted a developer to estimate the ranch's value. While Grandpa was still alive. He hadn't even been sick yet. I felt sick reading those words. Then I reached the page about me. Grandpa wrote. "When I asked you what you'd miss, you didn't mention the ranch. You didn't mention money. You smiled and said, 'Saturday mornings.'" A tear landed on the paper. I remembered that conversation perfectly. I'd forgotten it. He hadn't. The letter continued. "That answer told me everything I needed to know. You loved the memories. The others loved the property. There is a difference." Then came a sentence that made my entire body freeze. "Emma, everything your family believes they inherited today is temporary." I blinked. Temporary? What did that mean? I turned the page. Nothing prepared me for what came next. Folded inside the letter was a small brass key. Taped beneath it was a handwritten note. "Safety Deposit Box 417. First National Bank of Kentucky. Only you have legal access." I stared at the key for several seconds. My heartbeat became so loud I could hear it. Grandpa had never mentioned a safety deposit box. Not once. Why keep it secret? And what was inside? Before I could think any further, my phone vibrated. Dad. For the first time all day. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Emma." "Yes? I know today wasn't easy." I said nothing. He continued. "But I think your grandfather made the right decision." Another silence. Then he laughed quietly. "You always were too emotional." Before hanging up, he added one sentence. "Oh, and don't bother coming back to the ranch. We're putting it on the market." The call ended. I slowly lowered the phone. Then I looked at Grandpa's letter one more time. Everything they believe they inherited today is temporary. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled. Very slightly. Because deep inside, I had the strange feeling that Grandpa wasn't finished telling his story. And neither was I. I barely slept that night. Grandpa's letter lay open on my kitchen table. The small brass key sat beside it, catching the morning sunlight. Every time I looked at it, I heard Grandpa's words. Everything they believe they inherited today is temporary. Temporary. That word refused to leave my mind. If the will had already been read, if Dad legally owned the ranch, then what could possibly change? There was only one way to find out. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the First National Bank of Kentucky. The lobby smelled of polished wood and fresh coffee. An elderly teller smiled politely. "Good morning. How can I help you?" I placed the brass key on the counter. "I believe I have access to a safety deposit box." Her smile faded into professional curiosity. She examined the key, typed something into her computer, then looked back at me. "Miss Carter?" "Yes. Would you mind showing me your ID?" A few moments later, she returned with the bank manager, a man in his 60s named Charles Morgan. The moment he saw my driver's license, his expression softened. "So, you're Emma." The way he said my name made me pause. "You knew my grandfather?" He smiled. "For nearly 40 years. He spoke about you often." A lump formed in my throat. "He did?" "Every chance he got." Charles picked up a leather folder. "Please come with me." The vault was colder than I expected. Massive steel doors closed behind us with a heavy click. Charles stopped in front of a row of safety deposit boxes. He inserted one key. I inserted Grandpa's. The lock turned. He stepped back respectfully. "I'll give you some privacy." When he left, I slowly opened box 417. It wasn't filled with cash, or jewelry, or gold. Instead, there were neatly organized folders, a leather journal, several sealed envelopes, and a small velvet box. At the very top sat another handwritten note. "Emma. Start with the blue folder." I opened it. Inside were property records, land surveys, tax documents, legal filings. Most of them made no sense. Until I reached the last page. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Carter Family Irrevocable Land Trust." I frowned. I'd never heard those words before. The beneficiary page was folded. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. The first name listed was William Carter. Below it, I expected to see my father. Instead, I saw my own name. Successor trustee and sole beneficiary, Emma Grace Carter. I blinked. Then read it again. And again. No matter how many times I looked. The words didn't change. I wasn't imagining it. I was the only beneficiary. My hands shook as I searched for another explanation. There had to be one. The will yesterday had clearly said Dad inherited the ranch. So what was this? The answer came in Grandpa's journal. I opened to the bookmarked page. His handwriting filled every line. A will only transfers what a person still owns. The ranch stopped belonging to me 3 years ago. It belongs to the trust. I froze. He continued. I transferred every acre, every barn, every water right, and every mineral right into the trust after I learned your father was secretly negotiating with developers. I remembered what Dad had said at the funeral. "We're putting it on the market." A chill ran through me. He couldn't sell something he didn't legally own. The journal explained everything. 3 years earlier, Grandpa had discovered emails between Dad and a luxury development company. They planned to tear down the ranch, build expensive vacation homes, and split the profits. Grandpa never confronted him. Instead, he quietly hired attorneys, created the trust, transferred the land, and never told anyone. The will had left Dad nothing more than the illusion of ownership. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. Grandpa had seen everything coming. Every lie. Every greedy smile. Every fake tear. He had planned for all of it. Then I noticed another envelope. Across the front, it read, "Open this only after you understand the truth." I carefully opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me at 14 years old. Covered in dirt. holding a broken fence post beside Grandpa. On the back, he had written, "The person willing to repair the fence should inherit the land. Not the people waiting to sell it." I couldn't stop crying. Not because of the money. Because he had noticed things I never thought anyone saw. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Charles Morgan stood outside the private room. "Emma?" "Yes?" "I apologize for interrupting." He hesitated. "But your grandfather also asked me to give you this." He handed me a sealed legal envelope. The instructions were very specific. Only after you opened the trust documents. Inside was a business card. Margaret Ellis, estate litigation attorney. Attached was a handwritten note. "Emma. Call Margaret before anyone else. Not after. Before. Time matters. Grandpa." I immediately reached for my phone. Margaret answered on the second ring. "This is Margaret Ellis. My name is Emma Carter." Silence. Then. "I've been expecting your call." "You have?" "For almost 2 years." My heart skipped. She sounded completely unsurprised. "Your grandfather retained my firm in advance. I think we should meet today. Can it wait until tomorrow?" Her voice became firm. "No. Because if I'm right." She paused. "Your father is already trying to sell property he doesn't own." A cold wave washed over me. Dad. The developer. The ranch. Everything suddenly clicked. Margaret continued. "If he signs a purchase agreement before we act, this becomes much more complicated." I grabbed Grandpa's journal. "I'm on my way." As I hurried toward the bank exit, my phone buzzed with a news notification. Local developer announces major luxury ranch project, formal agreement expected this week. The location? Carter Ranch. I looked back at Grandpa's journal. Then whispered the words he could no longer say himself. Not this time. For the first time in my life. My father looked afraid. Not the fear of losing his own father. Not the fear of making a mistake. The fear of losing $8.4 million. His eyes never met mine. They stayed fixed on the trust agreement lying on the conference table. Ryan snatched the papers from his hands. "This has to be fake." Margaret Ellis didn't even blink. "It was filed with the Fayette County Clerk's Office on March 18, 3 years ago." She slid another document across the table. "Here's the certified recording receipt." Ryan scanned the page. The confidence drained from his face. "Dad." His voice cracked. "It's real." Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. Dad slowly sat down. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He whispered more to himself than to anyone else. "He planned this." Margaret answered calmly. "Yes. He planned it very carefully." Dad looked up. "He never trusted me?" "No," she replied. "He trusted you enough to let you prove him right." Those words hit harder than any shout could have. Ryan suddenly slammed both hands on the table. "This is Emma's fault." I stared at him. "My fault? You turned Grandpa against us." I almost laughed. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out Grandpa's letter. "I didn't write this." I placed it in front of him. "You can read it." Ryan grabbed the pages. His eyes raced across the first few paragraphs. Then, his face changed. There, in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Ryan never asks how I'm feeling, he asks what the ranch is worth." Ryan stopped reading. His ears turned bright red. He skipped ahead. Another sentence caught his eye. "Michael stopped visiting after I refused to sell the land." Dad looked away. Karen wasn't even in the room. Yet somehow, it felt like Grandpa was speaking directly to all of us. Ryan threw the letter back onto the table. He was confused. He was old. I felt something inside me snap. No. He remembered every birthday. He remembered every promise. He remembered teaching me to ride a horse when I was 8. I looked Ryan straight in the eyes. The only thing Grandpa never forgot was how people treated him. Ryan had no answer. Margaret cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter." She looked at my father. "I have another document you should see." She opened a second folder. Inside was a stack of emails. Printed. Highlighted. Dated. Dad's face went white before she even spoke. I recognize these. He swallowed. You should. They were recovered from your business account. She read one sentence aloud. Once Dad dies, we'll flip the ranch immediately. The old barns come down first. Ryan stared at Dad. You actually wrote that? Dad didn't answer. Margaret continued reading. We'll make more money from vacation homes than cattle ever could. The room became unbearably quiet. I closed my eyes. Grandpa had read those emails. Every single one. And he never said a word. Instead, he built the trust. Just then, Dad's phone rang. He answered immediately. Hello? His expression changed within seconds. What do you mean the deal is dead? No, that's impossible. I don't care what the title company found. I've already spent that deposit. The room froze. Margaret slowly removed her glasses. You spent it? Dad realized what he'd admitted. Too late. The call ended. He lowered the phone with trembling hands. Ryan stared at him. What deposit? Dad remained silent. Margaret quietly asked. How much? He barely whispered. 500,000. I blinked. You spent $500,000. Before you legally owned the ranch? He couldn't even look at me. Another knock came at the conference room door. The receptionist stepped inside. Ms. Ellis. There are 2 detectives here. Every head turned. Detectives? She nodded. They're asking for Michael Carter. Dad stood so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. What? Margaret frowned. Send them in. 2 detectives entered. One carried a thin case file. The older detective looked directly at my father. Mr. Michael Carter? Yes. We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding a real estate transaction and possible misrepresentation of ownership. Ryan whispered. Dad. The detective continued. You are not under arrest. But we strongly advise you not to leave town. Dad's face lost all color. The man who had walked into the office shouting now couldn't say a single word. As the detectives escorted him into another room, Dad turned back toward me. His eyes were full of panic. Not love. Not regret. Panic. Emma. Please. You can fix this. I remembered every birthday he forgot. Every graduation he skipped. Every phone call he never returned. Every Saturday Grandpa had quietly filled the empty space my father left behind. I looked at him calmly. Then I said the only words that felt true. You should have asked Grandpa to forgive you. While he was still alive. The door closed behind him. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral. The room felt peaceful. But Margaret wasn't smiling. She looked at another unopened folder and said quietly. Emma. I think your grandfather left us one more surprise. I looked down at the folder. Across the front, in Grandpa's handwriting, were 6 simple words. Open only after Michael tells the truth. The conference room felt strangely quiet after the detectives led my father into the hallway. Ryan stood frozen beside the table. For the first time in his life. There was no one left to hide behind. Margaret looked at the sealed folder Grandpa had left. She didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at me. Your grandfather was very specific. He said this folder should only be opened after Michael stopped lying. I glanced toward the closed door. I think that just happened. Margaret nodded. So do I. She carefully broke the seal. Inside were only 3 things. A handwritten letter. A flash drive. And a yellow envelope labeled evidence. Nothing about Grandpa was dramatic. If he saved something, it mattered. Margaret opened the letter first. She silently read the first page. Then the second. When she reached the end, she slowly removed her glasses. I had never seen an attorney look emotional. She handed the letter to me. You should read this yourself, Emma. If this envelope has been opened, then Michael has finally run out of lies. That saddens me more than you know. I loved my son. I never stopped loving him. But love isn't permission to ignore the truth. A lump formed in my throat. Grandpa wasn't writing with anger. He was writing with heartbreak. The next page explained something I'd never known. 5 years earlier, Dad's construction company had been close to bankruptcy. I remembered those months. The expensive truck disappeared. The family stopped taking vacations. Everyone blamed the economy. That wasn't the truth. Grandpa wrote. Michael came to me asking for $1 million. I froze. 1 million? I'd never heard about this. Grandpa continued. I agreed to help him. On one condition. He had to promise the ranch would never be sold. I already knew what happened next. Dad broke that promise. But Grandpa's next sentence stunned me. 3 weeks later, Michael secretly contacted developers anyway. I looked at Margaret. So Grandpa never gave him the money? She slowly shook her head. He did. What? He loaned your father $1 million. I couldn't believe it. And your father never repaid a single dollar. Margaret opened the yellow envelope. Inside was a signed loan agreement. Every page carried my father's signature. The repayment deadline had expired 4 years ago. Interest had continued accumulating ever since. Margaret quickly entered numbers into a calculator. She turned the screen toward me. Outstanding balance, $1,486,320. Almost $1.5 million. Ryan stared at the figure. I never knew. I believed him. For once. He looked genuinely shocked. Then Margaret picked up the flash drive. Let's see why William wanted us to watch this. She plugged it into her laptop. A single video appeared. Recorded, April 12th, 3 years earlier. Margaret clicked play. The screen came to life. There was Grandpa. Sitting on the ranch porch. Healthy. Smiling. He looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, I'm already gone. His voice instantly filled the room. It felt as though he were sitting beside us again. Emma, I hope you never have to watch this. But if you are, it means my family chose money over each other. He sighed deeply. I prayed I'd be wrong. He wasn't. Grandpa reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded a piece of paper. The day Michael asked me for money, I asked him one question. The video switched to an audio recording. Dad's voice filled the speakers. Dad, once this deal closes, you won't have to worry about the ranch anymore. Grandpa asked. You mean after I'm gone? A long pause. Then Dad answered. Eventually, yes. The room became painfully silent. The recording continued. Grandpa asked one final question. Would you still visit me if this land was worth nothing? Another pause. Then Dad laughed. Let's not play games. The recording ended. No answer. He never answered the question. Because the answer was obvious. Ryan covered his face with both hands. Oh my God. I thought Grandpa was just being stubborn. Margaret quietly closed the laptop. No. He was being careful. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened. One of the detectives stepped inside. Miss Carter? Yes? We've completed our preliminary interview. And? He looked at Margaret first. Then back at me. Your father admitted he knew the ranch might not legally belong to him. My heart skipped. He admitted that? The detective nodded. He believed the paperwork would never be discovered before closing. Margaret let out a slow breath. That's an important statement. The detective continued. We'll be forwarding everything to the district attorney. Dad hadn't just made a mistake. He had knowingly taken the risk. As the detective left, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Emma, this is Daniel Brooks from Blue Ridge Development. I just learned the truth about your grandfather's trust. I'd like to meet with you personally. There are things your father never told you. I showed the message to Margaret. She read it twice. Then looked at me with concern. I think you should hear what he has to say. You think so? She nodded. If a developer is reaching out directly instead of calling their lawyers, Something much bigger is going on. I stared at the screen. My father had lied. The trust had been hidden. The sale had collapsed. The detectives were involved. I thought I finally understood the whole story. I was wrong. Because somewhere inside Blue Ridge Development, someone knew a secret. Even Grandpa had never written down. 3 days later, the lawsuit arrived. I was standing on Grandpa's porch when the courier handed me the envelope. I didn't even need to open it. The return address told me everything. Michael Carter. My own father. He wasn't asking to speak. He wasn't asking to apologize. He was suing me. Margaret came to the ranch that afternoon. She spread the court papers across Grandpa's old kitchen table. The trust. The will. The ranch. They're challenging all of it. I poured us both coffee. Do they have a case? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the kitchen. Every shelf still held Grandpa's favorite coffee mugs. His old radio still sat on the windowsill. Finally, she smiled. They have an argument. But they don't have the truth. Dad's lawsuit claimed Grandpa had been confused during the last years of his life. That someone had manipulated him. That the trust wasn't really his decision. I almost laughed. Grandpa balanced his own investments, filed his own taxes, and beat me at chess 2 weeks before he died. Confused? Not a chance. Margaret opened another binder. I've been waiting for this. Inside were medical records, annual cognitive evaluations, letters from Grandpa's physician. Each one said the same thing. William Carter was mentally sharp and fully capable of making legal decisions. She slid them toward me. Your grandfather collected these himself. He knew this day might come. I shook my head. He planned for everything. Margaret smiled. He hoped he was wrong. That evening, I drove to the ranch one last time before the hearing. The sunset covered the fields in gold. The horses wandered quietly near the fence. Everything looked exactly the way it had when I was a little girl. I walked into Grandpa's workshop. The smell of sawdust and machine oil still filled the room. His old workbench hadn't moved an inch. Neither had the wooden stool where he always sat. On the wall hung dozens of photographs. Me learning to weld. Me holding my first fish. Me covered in mud after repairing a fence. Not one picture showed money. Not one showed contracts. Every memory was about time. That's what Grandpa had really been giving me all those years. Not property. His time. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small envelope tucked beneath the edge of the workbench. I'd somehow missed it before. Across the front, in Grandpa's handwriting, were 4 words. For Emma, just because. There were no legal instructions. No secret documents. Just a single folded page. I opened it carefully. Emma. If you're reading this, you're probably carrying a heavy heart. Don't let anger become your inheritance. People who chase money usually lose something they never realize they're spending. Their family. If Michael ever remembers that, welcome him home. If he doesn't, don't hate him. Pity him. Because no amount of money can buy back lost years. I folded the letter slowly. Grandpa had every reason to be angry. Yet even in his final words, he chose compassion. The next morning, Margaret called. There's something you should know. What happened? Your father rejected our settlement offer. I didn't even know we made one. We offered him exactly what your grandfather would have wanted. What was that? She smiled softly. The chance to walk away with his dignity. And? He wants the ranch instead. I looked across the fields. Some people never realize what they're actually fighting for. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Late Sunday evening. My phone rang. The caller ID said Ryan. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded different. No jokes. No arrogance. Just exhaustion. Emma, I need to tell you something. What is it? I found something in Dad's office. What? A letter. My heart skipped. From Grandpa? No. From Dad. Ryan took a deep breath. I don't think he ever meant for anyone to read it. What does it say? There was a long silence. Then Ryan whispered. It says, if Dad leaves everything to Emma, I'll challenge it, even if I know I'm wrong. I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked. Because seeing those words in writing somehow hurt more than hearing them. Ryan spoke again. I'll bring it to court. You'll do that? Yeah. For Grandpa. I looked out toward the porch where Grandpa used to sit every Saturday morning. For the first time since the funeral. I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not because I was certain I'd win. But because, at last, someone else in the family had decided to choose the truth. The courtroom was silent enough to hear papers turning. Judge Eleanor Brooks sat quietly, reading the trust documents for nearly 10 minutes. No one dared speak. Not my father. Not Ryan. Not even the reporters packed into the back row. Every few seconds, the judge underlined another sentence with her pen. I couldn't tell whether that was good news or bad. Margaret leaned toward me and whispered. She's looking for one mistake. What if she finds one? William Carter didn't make mistakes. For the first time that day. I believed her. Dad's attorney finally stood. Your Honor, even if the trust is legally valid, it is deeply unfair. The judge looked up. Unfair? Yes. My client is William Carter's only son. Leaving everything to a granddaughter while cutting out his own child is unnatural. The judge removed her glasses. Mr. Preston. There is no law requiring a parent to reward a disappointing child. A few people in the courtroom lowered their heads to hide their smiles. Dad didn't. He looked furious. Margaret stood. Your Honor, before you make your ruling, there is one final exhibit. She walked to the clerk and handed over a sealed envelope. The clerk examined the wax seal. Across the front, in Grandpa's handwriting, were the words, to be opened only if my son challenges my wishes. The judge studied it carefully. When was this received? Margaret answered. 3 years ago. It has remained sealed in my firm's evidence vault ever since. The judge nodded. Open it. The courtroom became perfectly still. Inside was a handwritten letter. The judge began reading silently. After only a few lines, her expression changed. She looked at my father. Then continued reading. By the last page. Even she looked emotional. She placed the letter on the bench. Mr. Carter. I believe these words were intended for you. She handed the letter to Dad. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. Michael. If you're reading this, then you've challenged my final wishes. That breaks my heart more than my death ever could. You will probably tell everyone Emma manipulated me. She didn't. You will probably say I forgot my own family. I didn't. The truth is much simpler. Dad swallowed hard. The courtroom was so quiet that every breath echoed. He kept reading. A father spends his life hoping his son becomes an honorable man. Money never interested me. Character did. I watched you become a successful businessman. I was proud. Then I watched money become more important to you than people. That is the day I lost my son, long before I lost my life. Dad stopped. His eyes filled with tears. Ryan quietly stared at the floor. The judge spoke softly. You should continue. Dad nodded. His voice shook as he read aloud. Emma never asked me for this ranch. In fact, she promised she would never fight for it. That promise is exactly why she deserves it. I felt tears running down my face. I had completely forgotten about that promise. Grandpa never had. Dad reached the final paragraph. His voice barely worked anymore. If you truly love this family, let Emma keep the ranch. If you love the ranch more than your family, then this courtroom will prove I made the right decision. Dad couldn't finish. The paper slipped from his hands onto the courtroom floor. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Finally, Dad stood up. He didn't look at me. He looked at the judge. Then he said something I never expected to hear. I would like to withdraw my petition. Even his own attorney turned toward him in shock. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Carter, are you certain? He slowly nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I've spent years blaming everyone else. My father wasn't punishing me. He was protecting what mattered to him. For the first time in my life. My father sounded honest. But Grandpa had once told me something I would never forget. The hardest apology isn't saying you're sorry. It's accepting the consequences after you say it. My father's apology had finally come. The consequences were only beginning. My father withdrew the lawsuit. Just like that. 3 months of legal filings, accusations, and headlines came to an end with a single signature. The judge approved the dismissal. Then she looked at me. Miss Carter, your grandfather trusted you with something very precious. I hope you'll protect it as well as he believed you would. I will, Your Honor. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral. I smiled without forcing it. Life became quiet again. The reporters disappeared. The phone stopped ringing. The internet found another story to chase. But the ranch. The ranch stayed exactly the way Grandpa had left it. Every Saturday morning, I walked the same fence line we had repaired together years ago. I drank coffee on the same porch. Sometimes I still caught myself turning around, expecting to see Grandpa sitting in his old rocking chair. Old habits don't disappear. Especially the beautiful ones. One afternoon, I found another surprise. While cleaning Grandpa's workshop, I discovered a small wooden box hidden behind an old tool cabinet. Inside were dozens of handwritten index cards. Each card carried a name. The local mechanic whose wife had cancer. The widow whose roof Grandpa quietly repaired every winter. A young veteran struggling to pay college tuition. Single parents. Retired teachers. Families who had lost everything in house fires. Beside every name, Grandpa had written one sentence. Help when you can, don't tell anyone. I realized something then. The greatest thing Grandpa ever built wasn't the ranch. It was the lives he quietly changed. That evening, I called Margaret. I know what I want to do. She smiled. I had a feeling. Within 6 months, we created the William Carter Legacy Foundation. Part of the ranch remained a working ranch. The old barn became a trade workshop where teenagers could learn welding, carpentry, and engine repair for free. The guest house became temporary housing for veterans rebuilding their lives. Every scholarship Grandpa had started, we expanded. Not because I wanted people to remember his name. Because I wanted them to experience his kindness. Ryan surprised me. One Saturday morning, he pulled into the driveway in Grandpa's old pickup. He climbed out holding a toolbox. I figured this fence won't repair itself. I looked at him. You know how? He laughed awkwardly. No. But maybe you could teach me. For the first time in years. We spent the entire day working side by side. Not talking much. Just working. Exactly the way Grandpa used to. Some relationships can't be repaired with words. They begin with actions. That was Ryan's first one. My father didn't come. Not for months. Then one rainy afternoon, I saw his truck parked at the front gate. He looked older. His shoulders were lower. His expensive watch was gone. So was the confidence he used to wear like armor. He walked slowly onto the porch. I don't expect forgiveness. I nodded. Okay. I just wanted to return something. He placed an old leather wallet on the table. It belonged to Grandpa. Inside was a faded photograph. Grandpa, Dad, and me. I couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Dad looked at the picture for a long time. I forgot who I wanted to become. His voice cracked. Your grandfather never did. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he stood. I'm selling my company. I looked up. Why? I've spent 30 years chasing money. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left earning back my family's respect. I didn't promise him anything. Some wounds need time. Some trust has to be rebuilt one choice at a time. But for the first time, I believed he understood the difference. On the first anniversary of Grandpa's passing, the entire town gathered at the ranch. Not because of an inheritance. Because of a tradition. Every year, volunteers now repaired homes for elderly residents free of charge. Mechanics fixed cars for struggling families. Local businesses donated supplies. Teenagers worked beside retired veterans. No cameras. No speeches. Just people helping people. Exactly the way Grandpa had lived. Before everyone left, Margaret handed me one final envelope she had found while organizing Grandpa's files. Across the front, in his familiar handwriting, were the words, "Open 1 year after I'm gone." I smiled through tears. He's still finding ways to surprise me. Inside was one short letter. Emma. If you're reading this, then you kept your promise. You didn't fight for what was mine. You protected it. There's a difference. I'm proud of you, not because you inherited my ranch, but because you inherited my heart. Remember what I told you when you were 12. People reveal who they truly are when they think nobody is watching. Now live your life the opposite way. Do the right thing, even when nobody is watching. Love. Grandpa. I folded the letter carefully and looked across the ranch. The sunset painted the fields in gold. The horses wandered peacefully through the pasture. The porch swing moved gently in the evening breeze. For a moment, I could almost hear Grandpa laughing. People often ask if I got revenge on my family. The answer surprises them. No. I didn't. Because revenge would have been watching them lose everything. Grandpa taught me something better. Let people live with the consequences of their own choices. That's a punishment no one can escape. My father lost the ranch because he chose greed. Ryan lost years with the grandfather who had loved him anyway. And I gained something worth far more than land or money. I gained proof that kindness outlives wealth. That character outlives reputation. And that the greatest inheritance anyone can leave behind is the kind of person they inspire you to become.